This is the Comics Alternative EuroComics, reviews of various translations from IDW Publishing from the last half of 2007. Greetings and salutations, and welcome to this episode of the Comics Alternative EuroComics. I'm Derek, and on this episode, I'm going to be discussing 6 titles in translation that were released from IDW Publishing during the last half of 2017. But before I get into those reviews, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative EuroComics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publications, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you'll find 4 of the books that I'm going to be discussing on this episode at 35% off of the cover price. For example, you can find Alack Sinner Volume 1, Age of Innocence, at $19.49. Calamity Jane, The Calamitous Life of Martha Jane Cannary, also at $19.94. You can also get the first volume of the Jerome Bloche series, The Shadow Killer, at $9.74. And then you can get A Story of Men by Zap at $12.99. You really can't beat their great prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Check out their website, dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the 2 guys with PhDs sent you. In this episode of the EuroComics series, it's not so much the 2 guys that's going to be talking, it's just me. And in fact, this is a very first for me and the Comics Alternative. I have never done a show solo before. Now, I've done interviews where I've been the only one interviewing my guest, and then I will, by myself, record the intro and outro to that introduction. But I've never done an entire episode of the Comics Alternative just by myself. And I'm a little intimidated by this. I have to hand it to my colleague, Paul Lai. He does his podcast many times with just himself, where he will have no one else on. And I know that Chris Marshall of the Collected Comics Library does it by himself the vast majority of the time. So I have to hand it to those guys and other podcasters who do it just by themselves with no one else helping them out, because I think it is a big task. When you're podcasting with a co-host, so in the past, I've done this EuroComic episode with my co-host, Edward Gavin. It's kind of easy because it's more like a conversation. We're going back and forth. Obviously, there's some preparation for the recording, but each of us as co-hosts can always rely on the other to help carry the conversation. It's not going to be like that now. So let me explain a little bit about how I got to where I am right now. This is actually, even though it's coming out in February, the January episode of the EuroComics series. Late last year, or the last part of last year, both Edward and I received review copies of a variety of books in translation from IDW Publishing, most of those from their EuroComics series. And we had intended to talk about them, if not in December of last year, then in January of this year, so just a few weeks ago. So Edward and I had planned on recording that show, But as listeners of the EuroComics series know, Edward recently became a father, and so his life has kind of been turned upside down. And one of those turning upside down phenomena that occurred is at the last minute he wasn't able to help me with the January show. We thought about postponing the discussion of these IDW books in translation until February. I really didn't want to do that because the publication date of some of these books has been several months now. So I wanted to go ahead and attend to these IDW texts. So I reached out to first Dean Mullaney, who is the editor of IDW's EuroComics series, and asked if maybe he would talk with me about some of these titles for the January show. He wanted to be on the podcast, but he was very busy. He recommended that I get in touch with IDW senior editor Justin Eisinger, and with the help of publicist Stephen Scott, I did get in touch with Justin, and he was going to come on to talk with me about all 6 of these titles because, you know, he's the senior editor there at IDW and intimately knows all 6 of these books that I'm going to be discussing on this episode. We couldn't arrange a common time when he was available and I was available to do this. And so I just thought, why the hell not? I'm just going to do this episode by myself and let you guys, the listeners, determine if this is something that I should do. So if you finish listening to this episode of the EuroComics series and whap your head and go, oy vey, Derek shouldn't do this by himself anymore, then please let me know. If I'm able to pull that off, then let me know that as well. One of the things I'll try not to do, I'll resist the temptation to keep starting and stopping and editing myself. I tend to do that when I make recordings by myself for podcasts, like the intros and outros to interviews. This being an entire episode that I'll be doing just by myself, I really don't want to start, stop, and to be a perfectionist. So I'm just going to talk with you as in a conversational way, I guess, as I do with my co-hosts, about these 6 books from IDW. So here we go. Now, the 6 titles that I will be discussing in this quote-unquote January episode of the EuroComics series are Alack, The Age of Innocence. This is written by Carlos Sampayo with art by Jose Munoz. After that, I'm going to take a look at Calamity Jane, The Calamitous Life of Martha Jane Cannary, 1852 through 1903, by Christian Perrissin and Matthieu Blanchin. After that, it's Jerome Bloche, Volume 1, The Shadow Killer, by Alain Dodier, with help by Pierre Makyo and Serge Tendre. After that, it's Hugo Pratt's Corto Maltese, Fable of Venice. Then I'm going to turn to Zeps, A Story of Men, and then wrap up with another Hugo Pratt narrative, The Man from the Great North. And basically, I'm going to take these in order of publication. So I'm going to begin with the first volume of IDW's 2-volume Alack series, The Age of Innocence. This came out in June of last year, and as I said, it's by Carlos Sampayo and Jose Munoz. If those names sound familiar, well, it's probably because you listened to the last episode of the EuroComics series that Edward and I did, because Sampayo and Munoz did a biography of Billie Holiday, which both Edward and I really enjoyed, and we discussed on that episode. This volume of Alack includes 11 stories, and they were translated by Diane Schultz, Brandon Kander, Dean Mullaney, Ariane Levesque-Looker, please excuse me for mispronouncing that name, and Catherine Labarbera. Some of them translated some of the stories, others translated some of the others in this collection. Now, both Sampayo and Munoz are from Argentina. And what we have with Alack, if you're unfamiliar with this character, he is a detective, a private eye, a hardened figure, much in the way of, let's say, Sam Spade or a Humphrey Bogart kind of detective figure. He used to be a police officer, and actually we get much of Alack's backstory in the first story in this collection, which is titled Talkin' with Joe. And in fact, a few words about the various stories that are collected in the Alack Sinner series. Now, between the two volumes, this one that I'm talking about right now and the second volume, which should be coming out in May of this year, it's called Alack Sinner, the Age of Disenchantment, includes stories that were published originally between 1975 and into the 2000s. This first volume collects 11 of those, and what the creators have done, along with the editors, is to arrange the stories in these two volumes chronologically by narrative time, not by publication date. And one of the things I noticed in reading Alack Sinner, The Age of Innocence, is that the style varies, and there are some of the stories in this collection that definitely do look like that they were published earlier, like in the 1970s, and others that look like later publications. So as you read through this first volume of Alack Sinner, you're not reading the stories as they were published, or at least in the order in which they were published, but you're reading them according to the time within the Alack Sinner narrative world. And even though each of these 11 stories could stand on its own, they are interconnected in a variety of ways. So, for instance, sometimes you will see a reference in a later story to something that happened to Alack in an earlier story in this particular volume. So, for instance, in the story, something like Twinkle Twinkle, you'll see a reference to what's known as the Webster case, which is the title of an earlier story. Or you will have a character from one story appear in a later story. But you also have characters that seem to appear in the vast majority of the stories, and one of those is Nick Martinez. And Nick is a he's a police officer, but he's a former police colleague of Alack's. But then Alack left the police force, and Nick is still a police officer, but Alack has a connection to the police force through Nick. And so every now and again, albeit reluctantly, Nick will help Alack out with a particular case that he's on. So again, although all 11 stories could stand on their own, they work really well together. And you do see across the 11 stories in this first volume a growth and a maturity to some degree of the character of Alack Sinner. Now, the first story in this collection, as I mentioned, Talking with Joe, is basically Alack Sinner's origin story. You find out that he used to be a police officer. He was on the force. He wasn't one of those officers that was on the take. And by the way, the narrative world of Alack Sinner seems to take place in New York. And the early stories especially have a kind of gritty 1970s, 1980s feel to them. So as you're reading through some of these, when you're introduced to a world of violent, even corrupt police officers, and New York City in its dirty, even pornographic best, it feels like you're watching a 1970s film based in New York with all the dirt and seedy underside that goes along with that. So Alack used to be a cop. His sister, Tony, was raped. Some of his fellow police officers who took the call, I guess they took things into their own hands. They whacked the people who raped Alack's sister. Alack didn't like that, even though he didn't like the fact that his sister got raped. And it caused problems within the police force. He was given really crappy jobs until he eventually decided he couldn't put up with it anymore and quit the police force. And then he started his business as a private detective. So in this first story, Talking with Joe, we get all of this backstory as he's telling it to the, I don't know whether to call him a barkeep or a soda hop, because he definitely looks like a soda hop, someone who I guess works at a soda shop a la 1950s. At least that's how he's dressed. But in this bar, diner, soda shop, if you want to call it, it's kind of a mixture of all of those. They serve drinks as well as food and whatnot. So anyway, Joe is the guy who works behind the counter, and Alex tells him his story, and so that's how we're introduced to Alex Sinner. And then the other 10 stories that follow that are primarily a series of cases that Alec has taken on. So following Talking with Joe are 2 apparently foundational cases in the Alex Sinner world. And I say apparently because this was my first introduction to Alex Sinner. But these are cases that keep coming up, that are mentioned at various points throughout the rest, or many of the following stories. And these stories are titled The Webster Case and then The Fillmore Case. And both of those are quite intriguing. And then following those 2 short stories, we have one of the 2 longest stories in this collection, and this is Viet Blues. It begins with Alec taking a walk in New York, up around Harlem, and sees a guy being beat up by a couple of thugs. So he saves this guy, and the guy happens to be African-American. He finds out his name is John Smith III, and that Smith is a piano player in this bar called Trains, I guess, from, based on, John Coltrane's name. So Alec befriends John Smith III, and he also helps him out in a variety of different ways. In other words, he gets drawn into John's life. John, when Alec first meets him, is getting beat up by some thugs who were hired by a gangster named Blade. And so Alec works throughout this story with John in terms of getting Blade's men off of John. John also has another problem in that he's a junkie, and I don't recall that they say what he's hooked on, but it's something like heroin. And so Alec, along with Alec's lover at the time, a woman by the name of Loretta, help John get off of whatever drug he's addicted to. And basically they do this by handcuffing him to a radiator in a room in an apartment, and I think it's Loretta's apartment, and they won't give him anything. Maybe they'll give him water, but definitely won't give him drugs, and basically make him go cold turkey the hard way. So this is an intriguing story, and it's one of the longest in this collection, along with the final story in this first volume, which is called Encounters. And Encounters, along with the penultimate story, Memories, are in some ways narratives that give us a little more backstory of Alex Sinner's life. As the story Memories their title, Memories, may suggest, this is a story where you get flashes of various events that took place in Alex's life in the past. And then in Encounters, which is by far the longest story in this collection, you get Alec basically waking up one day and deciding that he is going to see his estranged father. And so he gets in his car and drives about, 400 miles away, I guess, is what they say in this story, to go see his father, who by this point has distanced himself from his family, from Alec and Alec's sister Tony, and lives by himself, managing a small motel. So Alec goes up there and doesn't really, come to some complete understanding with his father, but we do get a little of Alex's past through his encounter with his father. And then after he sees his father, he comes back, and then we get further complications in various other encounters that Alec has for the remainder of this story. And most of the remainder of the story Encounters concerns Alec's relationship with one of his lovers that we see in an earlier story in this collection, Dark City, a woman by the name of Enfer. And Enfer ends up, Alec discovers, having a child by him. And so at least half of the story Encounters is based on, after Alex sees his father, is based on how he basically relates to both Enfer and his daughter. So that, in some ways, is a touching story. Another standout story in this collection is Twinkle, Twinkle. It's about a woman by the name of Sophie who hires Alack to find a brother of hers named Isser, who is a boxer. So that's a really well-done story. And one of the reasons why I wanted to point this out is that in many ways it marks kind of the typical characteristic of a detective narrative, right? I mean, when we see Alack at the very beginning of Twinkle, Twinkle, he's in his private eye office waiting for another job, and another job comes his way in the form of Sophie. And of course, like a good noir detective, Alack ends up having relations with Sophie as he works for her. Another standout in this first volume, and then I want to move on from here, is Life Ain't a Comic Book, Baby. Not only is this one of the most interesting stories in this collection, but it's also the funniest. As the title might suggest, there is a bit of self-reference in this story, Life Ain't a Comic Book, Baby. What happens is Alack is in his office one day, and he's visited by a couple of comics creators from Argentina by the name of Carlos Sampayo and Jose Munoz. And the reason that Carlos and Jose have come to see this private eye Alack Center in the United States is because they claim that they have a fictional character by the same name as the actual living Alack Center. So they wanted to travel to New York and actually meet this real-life Alack Center to see what he's about. So basically, Sampayo and Munoz are having a lot of fun with their fictional stand-ins, Carlos and Jose, as they visit Alack Center, stay with him, and create their comics while Alack Center is on a particular case. So that's it was really unlikely, and it's one of those stories that kind of gives you a double take because it stands out in that it's the one story in this collection that seems not to take itself near as serious as the other stories. Now, all of the narratives in this first collection, The Age of Innocence, is what I would consider classic crime comics, very noir. Obviously, it's in black and white, and in fact, you can look at the art in the Alack Center series, and you can definitely see where Frank Miller was influenced when he did his Sin City series. So I definitely recommend that you pick up Alack Center, The Age of Innocence, which came out in July of last year, and also pre-order the second volume, Alack Center, The Age of Disenchantment, which comes out in May of 2018. Now I want to move on to the second title that I'll be discussing on this episode of the EuroComics series. This is Calamity Jane, The Calamitous Life of Mary Jane Cannary, 1852 through 1903. This is written by Christian Perrissin with art by Matthieu Blanchin. And I guess I'm pronouncing these names correctly. You know, one of the other drawbacks of doing this particular show solo is that I don't have Edward to tell me if I'm mispronouncing the French names, because he usually corrects me on that. But anyway, yeah, this is by Christian Perrissin and Matthieu Blanchin. This work is translated by Diane Schultz and Brandon Kander. In fact, this is one of two titles that I am discussing on this episode that is by IDW, and it's a translated work, but it's not part of IDW's EuroComics series. The other such text is Zepp's A Story of Men, which I'll get to later. I have heard of Christian Perrissin before. I know that he's written a couple of books that have been translated and published through Humanoids, Cape Horn and El Nino. This was the first time, though, that I have seen anything by Matthieu Blanchin. I'm not even sure if any of his work has been translated into English. This is a biography of Calamity Jane, better known as, or I guess, whose real name is Martha Jane Cannary. And if you listened to my and Paul's favorites of 2017 show, you'll know that Calamity Jane, The Calamitous Life of Mary Jane Cannary, was one of my, I guess, honorable mentions from last year. This is truly a wonderful book, and I'm tempted to say that it's one, if not the favorite, one of my favorites, if not the favorite, of the ones that I'm discussing on this episode. This seems to be a pretty thorough comics biography of Calamity Jane, and I say seems to be because, honestly, I really don't know much about the life of Calamity Jane outside of what I've picked up from pop culture, various stories here and there. So I don't have anything to base it on, right? So it's not as if I could say, Perrissin is correct in his portrayal of this part of her life, but is a little weaker on this other part. I'm just not sure. But there are a variety of books out there on Calamity Jane. So if you wanted to read Perrissin and Blanchin's graphic biography and then read a prose version, a prose biography on Calamity Jane, then you can compare the two. But I didn't have time to do that for this particular episode. This book is divided more or less into three sections. The first section covers the year 1852 to 1869, so it's the earliest part of Martha Jane Cannary's life. And then in the second section, it covers her life from 1870 to 1876. And then the third section from 1877 to 1903. One of the most moving parts of this graphic biography, actually, for me at least, takes place in this first section, so the early part of her life. And here we get, at the very beginning, in a section called The Mormon Trail, we get an early history of Martha Jane Cannary and her family, but we also get a little bit of history of the United States during this part of the 19th century. And I think that Perrissin and Blanchin do a very good job of kind of melding what was going on in the United States, especially the American West during the time of Calamity Jane's early life, and then how she came to be the woman who would eventually become Calamity Jane. So we learn how she and her family moves out to Utah, how eventually after both the mother and then the father die, Martha Jane takes care of her other siblings, and she has quite a few, then literally runs off and abandons them in order to seek her own life and also to escape what she thinks might be a rather confining, conventional married life as a Mormon woman. In fact, she goes in a completely opposite direction where you would expect a Mormon woman at the time to go. And in this first section where she is making things on her own and roughing the wilderness, including a very harsh winter, I don't want to say it's a slog in a bad way getting through this section, but it's a slog in a very good way because the way that the narrative is presented is very similar to, I guess, the experience that Martha Jane Cannary had herself on her own, first time out in the wilderness, trying to make her way. So there's not much food, there's the danger of wolves, and then also there's an encounter that she has with an older man that in many ways kind of defines, or at least sets the stage of the woman that Calamity Jane will eventually become. In this second section of the graphic biography, again covering 1870 to 1876, we get what many would consider some of the core elements of Calamity Jane's life. And in fact, in a section called The Badlands, we see Martha Jane Cannary living with a few other people in the Badlands. And one night she tells them the story of how she met Wild Bill Hickok. So I find this section really fascinating in that we don't get a straight out, in a straight out biographical sense, a story of how Calamity Jane met Wild Bill Hickok. We get it in a flashback where Martha Jane Cannary is telling some of the people that she's staying with how she met Wild Bill Hickok and eventually had a child by him, a young girl that she names Janie. And so I think this is an interesting narrative twist in this biography. And the fact that it takes place close to the very middle, I think, makes it very significant. Because in many people's eyes, if they know anything about Calamity Jane, is that she's connected in some way with Wild Bill Hickok. And so we get that story in this section. We also get a very moving part of the story of her biography after she leaves where she's living in the Badlands with her daughter, young daughter Janie. She is working in a bordello, but she's not plying the typical bordello trade. She's working behind the bar. And she brings her young daughter Janie in with her. And the, house madam realizes that that is really not a place for Calamity Jane to bring her daughter. And so she suggests that maybe she leave her daughter with some people who could adequately care for them, or for her daughter Janie. And so what Calamity Jane decides to do is to leave Janie with a family by the name of the O'Neills. And O'Neill is a successful businessman, but he and his wife cannot have a child. So they decide to adopt Janie on the condition that Calamity Jane, or Martha Jane, not constantly try to contact her daughter Janie, but to find out about how she's doing through the O'Neills. And she honors that pledge. Now, she does see Janie later on in life, and we get a part of the biography where this takes place. But she never reveals to the older Janie that she is her mother. Although one of the things that happens in the last half of this biography is that you see Calamity Jane writing a series of letters, and in fact it's through these letters that much of the last half of Perrissin's biography is told in terms of the life of Calamity Jane. It's through what Jane writes to her daughter Janie in hopes of giving her all of these letters later in life. Now, the last third of this graphic biography, which takes place between 1877 and 1903, is basically the story of Calamity Jane as many people know her through popular culture, right? And in fact, we have in this section much of the story of how Martha Jane Cannary became the celebrity figure Calamity Jane, and how in many ways, especially later in life, she lived on, or at least tried to live on, that reputation, on that celebrity. So we see her as a public figure, as a celebrity, and as a businesswoman. It's also in this section that we see Calamity Jane in Deadwood. I like this, especially because I absolutely loved the HBO series Deadwood, where we did have a fictional Calamity Jane. So the Calamity Jane that we get in Perrissin and Blanchin's biography is a little different than the Calamity Jane that we get in Deadwood. Although one of the things that both Perrissin and Blanchin point out, especially over the last half of this biography, is the problems that Martha Jane Cannary had with alcohol. She was a calamitous and a rambunctious figure, And it was often that she drank a little bit too much to her detriment, and it didn't serve her well in terms of some of the jobs that she had, some of the interviews that were conducted with her. Overall, though, I think that this is an amazing biography, and it was one of the most enjoyable reads I did in the last half of 2017. So here's another book in translation I highly recommend: Christiane Perrissin and Matthieu Blanchin's Calamity Jane, The Calamitous Life of Martha Jane Cannary, 1852 to 1903. The next title that I want to discuss is part of a series that apparently has never been translated in English before. This is Alain Dodier's Jerome Bloche series. And this first volume, which is titled The Shadow Killer, was published by IDW in their EuroComic imprint in September of 2017. So this is a figure, the character Jerome Bloche, created by Alain Dodier. And this volume was also scripted by Pierre Makyo and Serge Tendre. It's translated by Adrien Levelesque-Looker and Dean Mullaney. And as I mentioned, it's published in English for the first time. Dodier is a two-time winner of the Angoulême Festival for Jerome Bloche as the best series and as the best youth series. And I didn't know this, but in terms of digging around on the web, I wanted to know if there was any connection between this fictional character, Jerome Bloche, and the actual English writer, Jerome. And apparently there is. The name of Dodier's character came from the English writer and humorist best known for his travelogue, 3 Men in a Boat, the British writer Jerome. So there you go. But Jerome Bloche as a series began in 1982, and there were 25 graphic albums published in France. And we're just now in the United States getting, and I guess in England, getting translations of this series through IDW. So this is the first volume, and the second volume, Jerome Bloche, The Paper People, comes out in June of this year. So look out for that. Jerome is a young man around 20 years old, and I guess the best way of describing him is a private eye in training. During the day, he translates detective novels, and also he dreams of being a detective. But by night, he takes courses from a character named Professor Masson, who is teaching him and others in his class how to be private eyes. And what happens throughout the course of this first volume, The Shadow Killer, is that there is a mysterious figure who is not clearly seen, thus the name, The Shadow Killer, but he seems to wear some kind of feathery headdress, and he kills his victim with some kind of what appears to be a poison dart. And Jerome, because he is taking classes to be a private eye, thinks that he can handle this case. And so he sets out on his own, actually, along with the help of Professor Masson, to find out who this killer actually is. He's an interesting figure in that while he is a detecting figure, and even a detective in many ways, like Alex Sinner, he's not a professional one, and in fact, he is rather bumbling at times. And in fact, the way that the publicists have described this volume is that Jerome Bloche is more Will Ferrell than Humphrey Bogart, because he kind of bumbles around and finds his way inadvertently into the answer of some of the questions that he has. Another way of describing this graphic novel is that it seems to be very much like the Hergé's Tintin stories. It does have a clean line look to it, and it does seem to be intended for all age audiences. This is a relatively short narrative. It's just about 48 pages long, or at least 48 pages of story. But there's some supplemental material in the back, some photographs of Alain Dodier and some sketches, some early sketches of who Jerome Bloche, how he was going to look and how old he was going to be. And then even a section of one of the first stories of Jerome Bloche. It really is a nice narrative. Jerome is helped at times by his, I guess you can call it his girlfriend, Babette. I don't know if she's so much a girlfriend as a young woman who helps him out and helps him not to look so ridiculous at times. But, he's not too much of a foolish character. He is serious in what he does. He solves cases in very unconventional ways, as probably you would expect a 20-year-old to do. And this really was a fun read. And I'm definitely going to get the second volume that's going to be coming out in June, The Paper People. Okay, let's move on to the fourth title that I'm going to be discussing on this episode of the EuroComics series, and this is the next in IDW EuroComics Corto Maltese series. This is Corto Maltese, Fable of Venice, and this came out in September of last year. Of course, this is by Hugo Pratt, and this is translated by Dean Mullaney and Simone Castaldi. And Pratt, if you didn't know, is Italian. He published in French, and he, in 2005, was inducted in the Will Eisner Award Hall of Fame. He should be no stranger to listeners of the Comics Alternative, and in fact, we've discussed at least a couple of past volumes of IDW's Corto Maltese series. Now, this is the fifth of the Corto Maltese books that IDW has published. They began with Corto Maltese Under the Sign of Capricorn in December of 2014, and I do remember that we reviewed that volume. After that, they published Beyond the Windy Isles in July of 2015, Celtic Tales in February 2016, In Siberia in March of last year, and then in September of 2017, Fables of Venice. Now, in many ways, this volume, relatively short, is I guess you could call it a graphic novel, because unlike earlier volumes such as Under the Sign of Capricorn and Beyond the Windy Isles and Celtic Tales, this is not a collection of individual stories. This is one long narrative, in many ways like In Siberia, that came out a few months before Fables of Venice. So this is a tribute to Hugo Pratt's hometown because, as the title suggests, it does take place in Venice, Italy. It's a complex mystery thriller, and it involves, get this, Freemasons, occultists, and esotericists. And it's set in Venice during the rise of fascism in 1921. And in this story, Corto Maltese is ostensibly in search of an emerald known as the Clavicle of Solomon. But in his search, I guess he ends up questioning whether the object of his quest will open hidden doors of magic and unravel the nature of time and space, or if it's merely, as Sam Spade said in The Maltese Falcon, the stuff that dreams are made of. And there's even a reference to that phrase. One of the things that stood out to me about this volume in the Corto Maltese series is that it has to be the most fantastic and dreamlike story that I remember reading of Corto Maltese. And in fact, there are sections where things occur. I wasn't sure exactly if this was happening to Corto Maltese or if this was going on in some kind of dream world, maybe while he was asleep or while he was knocked out. And so that's one of the things I really appreciated about Fable of Venice, is that you're not exactly sure of the narrative ground you're standing on throughout much of this book. If you're a fan of Hugo Pratt and especially of Corto Maltese, then this is definitely a volume that you should pick up. And if you haven't gotten on board with IDW's Corto Maltese series, what's wrong with you? In fact, you don't even have to start with the very first one that they released, Under the Sign of Capricorn, or even Beyond the Windy Isles. And you can start with this one. I think it's a great introduction to Corto Maltese and then Hugo Pratt as a whole. And IDW does a wonderful job in the packaging of this book. Now, all of the Corto Maltese books are paperback, but the paper of the covers is a thick cardboard. It's a French cover, so there are fold-overs, and so it's a very hefty volume, and it's also European graphic album size. And in fact, all the books that I am discussing on this episode have similar sizes, shapes, and wonderful production value. In fact, that's one of the things that I love about IDW books is the production value. The next graphic album in translation that I want to discuss is something that is new to me, or at least this creator is new to me. His name is Zepp, or at least he's known as Zepp, but Zepp is a pseudonym for Philippe Chappuis, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that last name, is Chappuis, so it could be pronounced Chappuis. And he is a comics creator from Switzerland. And this, I think, is his first work published in English. Maybe I'm wrong there, but I couldn't find anything else by Zepp that, at least on Amazon.com, that was published in translation. Now, this book is translated by Ivanka Hannenberger, and as I mentioned, it's one of the 2 of the 6 that I'm discussing on this episode that is not part of IDW's EuroComic series. Now, not only is this my first introduction to Zepp, but I've been seeing a lot of references to Zepp lately. In fact, IDW is going to be publishing another Zepp narrative in May of this year called A Strange and Beautiful Sound. And the solicit is, I think, pretty compelling. I want to read it to you. William chose silence 25 years ago by joining the Carthusian religious order. When an inheritance forces him to leave the monastery for Paris, he must master a whole new world and question certainties forged long ago. He meets Marie, a young woman whose days are numbered due to an incurable illness, and who resolutely decided on making the most of the time she had left. This, in turn, will force William to face new questions and complicates his choice in a powerful story that truly addresses the meaning of life. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to read you that solicit is that in many ways it jibes with the kind of story that A Story of Men is about. It's a more realistic, if you want to call it slice of life narrative that has nothing fantastical or even egregiously genre-like about it. This is a story of 4 former band members who get together around, 18, 19 years after the band broke up. And it's about their lives that they've had since breaking up and getting back together, how their past lives kind of influence the way that they relate with one another today. So in many ways, it's kind of a band getting back together narrative. Now, if my exposure to Zepp was limited to only these two titles, A Story of Men, which I have read, and A Strange and Beautiful Sound, that I haven't read, but, I've just read you the solicitation, I would think that Zepp is someone who writes about more realistic, true-to-life story matters. That's not the case, though, because another book or another title that Zepp is a part of is Infinity 8. And in fact, in July of this year, the first collected volume of Infinity 8 will be coming out from Titan. And this is a fantastical story, kind of sci-fi-ish. I'll read part of the solicit, and you'll get a taste of how different this is from A Story of Men and A Strange and Beautiful Sound. The city-sized deep space cruise ship Infinity 8 stops halfway en route between the Milky Way and Andromeda, blocked by a massive field of debris containing wreckage and artifacts from countless planets, cultures, and possibly dimensions. The captain of the ship calls upon 8 of the ship's top security to investigate the anomaly, each one sent out in a parallel time loop to collect information which can then be assembled to hopefully discover the truth before disaster erupts. And Zepp does this, or he writes this series with Louis Trondheim and with artist Dominique Bertheil. I'm going to check this out because I want to see how radically different this work that Zepp contributes to is very different from the book that I'm about to talk with you about, which is A Story of Men. As I mentioned, A Story of Men is a narrative where band members get back together, and the band was called Tricky Fingers. It was made up of Sandro, Ivan, Frank, and JB. And the story begins when Ivan, Frank, and JB are together on a plane flying to see their old bandmate, Sandro. After the band broke up, Sandro was really the only member who took his music seriously, or at least went on with his musical career. And so Sandro became a musical star outside of the band Tricky Fingers, whereas Ivan, Frank, and JB kind of drifted away from music, did their own things, and had their own lives. So here we are about 18 or 19 years after the band breaks up, and Ivan, Frank, and JB are on a plane. They are going to meet up with Sandro and spend several days with him and his family. And while they're on the plane, we get some flashbacks primarily through what I would argue is the protagonist, the main protagonist of this story, which is Ivan. When the story begins, Ivan is 43 years old. He's in a relationship with a woman named Beatrice. Beatrice is wanting a family. Ivan is not wanting a child. And he's kind of at a dead end in his life. He doesn't really know what he wants to do. He hasn't written any music in 18 years, but he decides to go with Frank and JB to see Sandro. Another thing we get from a series of flashbacks as Ivan is on the plane on his way to see Sandro is some complicating situations that had occurred 18 years previous with Sandro. Ivan had been involved with a woman named Annie when they were in the band together, but eventually Annie developed a relationship with Sandro, which didn't help the cohesiveness of the band. Also, the band had a tendency to kind of self-destruct in that the members, although they got along well enough, individually, sometimes the members seemed to kind of sabotage what the band wanted to accomplish. So eventually, Sandro took his musical aspirations outside of the band, and along with that, he took Ivan's girlfriend, Annie, and they had a life together, and Sandro had a musical career after Tricky Fingers broke up. So now 18 years later, Frank, JB, and Yvonne are on their way to see Sandro. They hang out with him. They have, some good times just catching up and remembering the times past. Apparently, all of the bad feelings have been buried, especially between Sandro and Frank and JB. Not so much, though, between Yvonne and Sandro, even though they seem to get along well enough. Now, remember, Sandro now has a relationship with Annie, and they apparently had a child together. Now, I say apparently, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but I will say that toward the end of this narrative, we find out that Sandro and Annie's child is no longer alive, and that what Yvonne learns toward the end of this story kind of changes his mind in wanting to have a child with his current girlfriend, Beatrice. This is a very moving and well-paced narrative. Zepp is not only adept at storytelling, but also his art, I think, is absolutely marvelous. And one of the things that struck me about A Story of Men is how Zepp utilizes monocolors, sometimes grays, sometimes light blues or azures, light purples, in order to indicate shifts in narrative time. So going back and forth between past and present, and then different times in the past, make it a lot easier with different colored panels. But those colored panels are muted tones, and so it's nothing that's really striking or stands out. But I think they're great temporal narrative devices. I strongly recommend A Story of Men. I'm intrigued by Zepp now. I want to go out and get his next book, A Strange and Beautiful Sound, from IDW, again, which comes out in May of this year. But I also want to check out that Titan series, Infinity 8. And I guess the individual issues of Infinity 8 are going to be coming out soon, like within the next month or two. And then the collected volume from Titan will be out in July. Okay, I'm going to end this solo EuroComics episode by going back to Hugo Pratt. His book, The Man from the Great North, was published by IDW in November of last year. This work is translated by Dean Mullaney, Simone Castaldi, and Ariane Levezique Looker. And this is the first English edition of Pratt's 1980 classic, and it also includes an incomplete second story of the protagonist, plus some of Hugo Pratt's storyboards drawn for a movie version of The Man from the Great North. This is the first volume in IDW's ongoing One Man, One Adventure series. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure what the One Man, One Adventure series is all about. I tried to find a bit of information on this on IDW's website, and outside of the title of the series, One Man, One Adventure, and the fact that The Man from the Great North is the first book in the series, I couldn't find out anything about what is intended by the One Man, One Adventure series. So I'm curious to see what future books comes out. This is the story of a character by the name of Jesuit Joe. He is a lone traveler of French, Canadian, and Mohawk descent. It takes place in northern Canada around 1920, with Jesuit Joe wandering the icy wastes, engaged in, I guess, what you can call an obsessive religious search for the absolute, if you want to get philosophical. He wears the red jacket of a Canadian Mountie, although he's not a Mountie himself, but it's one that he found in a hut, and him taking this Canadian Mountie jacket gives rise to a series of misunderstandings when he's mistaken for a member of the mounted police. his actions in response to a variety of moral choices he has to make throughout this book kind of highlight his unusual ethical code in his disturbing and complex personality. In fact, one of the things that struck me in reading The Man from the Great North is the question of how to read Jesuit Joe. He definitely doesn't come across as an admirable or heroic figure, but he's one that's complicated in ways that I would say is similar to the character of Alex Sinner. Although with Alex Sinner, you know that he is always on the side of the law, however he interprets the law. With Jesuit Joe, you're not entirely sure what side, so to speak, that he's on. He ends up doing a number of things, including killing, that leave you wondering, why the hell did he do that? What was in it for him? What's going on in his mind? And in fact, at times he kills with kind of a terrible ease, and he shows, at times cruelty, ferocity, but every now and again his mood shifts from something that's a little more violent to acts of kindness and even compassion. So again, another thing that's kind of complicated about the protagonist Jesuit Joe. You really don't know how to read him, which is one of the things I appreciated about this narrative. Now, all the while that we see Jesuit Joe on his search for something, he's being tracked by, I guess, a character that you could call his nemesis, someone by the name of Sergeant Fox, whose mission is to capture Jesuit Joe and bring him to justice. And so the actual published story that came out, The Man from the Great North, ends with this confrontation between Sergeant Fox and Jesuit Joe. And then what I mentioned earlier, the incomplete second story of Jesuit Joe, in many ways picks up where the published, completed first story leaves off. And where the first story left off is quite ambiguous. In other words, if you just stopped the story there, you really wouldn't know exactly what happened, which I'm fine with. You know, as listeners of the podcast know, I prefer ambiguous endings to ones that are neatly tied up. So this incomplete story that's included in the IDW edition kind of de-ambiguizes, if you want to call it that, and clears up what kind of happens maybe at the end of the published Jesuit Joe story. But in its own way, this incomplete story ends ambiguously because it's incomplete. So it's an interesting look at another side of Hugo Pratt, and I think if you wanted to read The Man from the Great North alongside of a couple of Corto Maltese volumes from IDW, you'd have a pretty good sense of the variety of Hugo Pratt's art. So I definitely suggest that this is something that you should check out. Again, it's the first in IDW's One Man, One Adventure series. Whatever that is, I'm not sure. So there you go. My January EuroComics episode, one that I did by myself. I hope I didn't screw it up too much. I started off with Carlos Sampayo and Jose Munoz's Alex Sinner, the first volume, The Age of Innocence. After that, I looked at Calamity Jane, The Calamitous Life of Martha Jane Cannary, 1852 to 1903, written by Christian Perrissin with art by Matthieu Blanchin. After that, I looked at Jerome Bloche, Volume 1, The Shadow Killer, by Alain Dodier, Pierre Makyo, and Serge Tendre. Next, I discussed Hugo Pratt's Corto Maltese, Fable of Venice, then Zepp's A Story of Men, and then after that, back to Hugo Pratt with The Man from the Great North. I hope you've enjoyed this January EuroComics episode, albeit a little bit late. I should be back later this month with another episode of the series, this time with Edward in tow, and he and I are going to be discussing a couple of recent publications from Christophe Chaboutez. And if you like books like this, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. As I mentioned at the top of the show, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you'll find many of the titles that I discussed today at great discounts. You can find Alex Sinner, Age of Innocence, Calamity Jane, Jerome Bloche, Volume 1, and A Story of Men, all at 35% off of the cover price. You can't beat those prices at Discount Comic Book Service. And after you do get your titles in translation there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought I did in terms of this solo episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I am Derek@comicsalternative.com. And we are all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. We also have a Slack channel, so check that out. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. Edward and I will be back soon with the February EuroComics episode. Until then, take care.